People always think they know who holds the real power in a courtroom. The loudest voice. The biggest ego. The one who smirks like the world owes him something. On that day, everyone thought it was him. A heavy-set man with designer sunglasses pushed onto his forehead, cheap jewelry clinking like it meant something, and a grin that could curdle milk. He walked in like he owned the place, like the courtroom was his stage and arrogance was his script. And the moment he sat down, he leaned back, crossed his arms, and whispered loud enough for the world to hear. He's rich enough. I don't pay people who already have more than me. Before we dive into this incredible case, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing where my viewers are around the world. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss more unbelievable cases like this one. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. The audience chuckled nervously. The plaintiff lowered his gaze, and for a moment, a rare moment, even Judge Judy was silent. Not the silence of fear, no. The silence of someone who has been underestimated too many times. Someone who knows that storms don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, then tear the world open. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam her bench. She simply adjusted her glasses. And the courtroom felt colder. The landlord, an older man with gentleness in his eyes and tired lines carved into his face, clutched a stack of documents. Not shaking from weakness, but from dignity. The kind people only notice when it's on the verge of being betrayed. He didn't come here for revenge. He came to defend something that mattered more than money, self-respect. But the man beside him didn't see that. He leaned forward and laughed again, louder this time, as if humility was a language he never learned. This whole system favors rich people, he scoffed, shrugging like unpaid rent was a badge of honor. Why should I help him get richer when I can use his money to live better? The room shifted and you could feel it. A moral earthquake rumbling under polished floors and polished lies. For a split second, even Judge Judy looked like the smaller figure in the room. Quiet, composed, underestimated. And then, something flickered in her eyes. Not anger, something colder, sharper. The kind of calm that only people with real strength carry. She didn't call him out. Not yet, she didn't need to. She simply asked one question, her voice soft, almost too soft. How long has he been waiting for you to act like a man instead of a parasite? No scream, no slam. Just precision. Surgical. You could feel the air leave the heavy man's lungs. His smile stumbled. His confidence cracked. Something was hidden here, and Judy already saw it. A truth that would rip the mask from arrogance and reveal everything the world wasn't supposed to see. Because this case wasn't about rent. It wasn't about entitlement. It was about a man who mistook generosity for weakness, and a judge who knew that sometimes the smallest person in the room is the one who stands tallest when the truth arrives, and that truth was only beginning to surface. Before I tell you how Judge Judy turned silence into a sword, tell me in the comments, have you ever seen someone mock kindness, thinking it made them strong? Your story might help someone today. Now let's continue. For a heartbeat, the courtroom remained frozen, not by noise but by stillness. That's the dangerous thing about quiet power. When it finally speaks, the world has to listen. But the man at the defense table, he didn't understand silence. Not the kind Judge Judy wielded. His world only respected volume, swagger, and the childish throne he built from excuses. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the stand, his belly pressing against the wood as he chuckled. A smug, careless laugh that carried across the courtroom like cheap perfume. Lady, I don't have to act like anything, he said, waving a dismissive hand in Judy's direction. Rich people don't suffer. They just pretend to. The landlord's head lowered again, not because of shame, but because kindness has a way of breaking when it's stepped on enough times. His voice was soft when he finally spoke. I trusted him, he said. When he moved in, he didn't have much. He told me he needed a chance. I lowered the rent for him, even waived the security deposit at first. He said he'd catch up when he got on his feet. The defendant snorted, rolling his eyes. Yeah, and I did get on my feet. Which is exactly why I don't need to pay. He's got plenty. Someone like him losing a little money? That's nothing. A ripple of discomfort went through the room. You could see people shifting, lips tightening, cheeks flushing. People hate arrogance, not because it's loud, but because it humiliates the quiet truths we live by. Effort, respect, decency. Judge Judy blinked once, slowly, as if absorbing every atom of disrespect floating in the air. She didn't respond to the man, not yet. Instead, she turned to the landlord. How many months of rent are owed? She asked softly. 7 months, he replied. His voice cracked not from weakness, but from disappointment so deep it sat heavy on his breath. He always promised he'd pay soon. He always had a story, a new excuse, and I believed him. The defendant leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head. spreading himself wide like a man convinced the world could fit in the palm of his arrogance. "I don't see the issue," he scoffed. "He lives in one of the nicest neighborhoods. Plenty of tenants, plenty of money, someone like him. He'll be fine, that was it." That was the phrase that exposed him. Worse than unpaid rent, worse than excuse entitlement. He believed the world existed to cushion him. He believed generosity was a resource he deserved to exploit. He believed money erased morality. Judy's voice cut through the stillness. Not sharpened, but weighted, like a judge handing down fate not through force, but through truth. "Tell me," she said, her tone calm as a whisper, "when exactly did you decide that someone else's kindness was your birthright?" The man's jaw tightened. He didn't have an answer. So he did what insecure people always do, and he attacked. "You know what?" he snapped. "You judges live in your mansions. Act like you understand people like us. He's a landlord. He profits off people just trying to survive." He pointed at Judy, a reckless hand fueled by ego. "And don't look at me like you have moral high ground. You think you're better than the rest of us." The room inhaled sharply. Even those who didn't know law knew something sacred had just been violated. But Judy, she didn't flinch. Sometimes power is loud. Sometimes it's a whisper. Sometimes it's a pause so devastating it strips lies before words can. "I don't think I'm better than you," she said. "I just don't behave worse," silence thundered. The defendant blinked. Twice. He didn't expect intelligence, and he expected intimidation. "So let me understand," she continued, leaning forward ever so slightly, her glasses sliding down just enough to reveal steel beneath kindness. "He gave you shelter when you had nowhere. He gave you time when you had none. He extended grace when you didn't deserve it. And your response was, to steal from him and mock him? I didn't steal anything." The man's voice was suddenly smaller. "I just used the opportunity." Judy's eyes darkened, not with anger but with sorrow for what people become when they confuse survival with selfishness. "No," she said. "You abused help and you called it strategy. You hid behind need long after you had enough. You turned compassion into currency. That is an opportunity." She let the words fall like judgment already cast. "That's cowardice pretending to be clever." The man's shoulders stiffened. His confidence flickered. The bravado drained, revealing something raw, fragile. Fear of accountability. I contributed," he stammered. "I cleaned. Sometimes. I helped maintain." "You lived rent-free," Judy cut in gently. "Not because you couldn't pay, but because you didn't want to." A lesson hung in the air, heavy as truth. Needing help is human. Abusing it is character. The plaintiff swallowed hard, eyes glassy. Not because he wanted victory, but because decency had finally been defended. And in that moment, Judge Judy wasn't the feared judge or the sharp-tongued legend. She was what real authority looks like when stripped bare, quiet fairness carved by years of watching humanity fail and rise in the same breath. She looked back at the defendant, her voice soft, not attacking. Worse, disappointed. "You didn't come here to prove you're right. You came to justify never being wrong." The man opened his mouth to respond, and suddenly the courtroom no longer belonged to his arrogance. It belonged to justice, waiting, ready to expose the part of the story no one saw coming yet. Because there was still something hidden, something he didn't know would surface. And when it did, arrogance would crumble, dignity would rise, and the truth would take everything else with it. Arrogance has a rhythm, loud, confident, and always convinced the world will clap along. But there's a moment, a very specific moment, when that rhythm falters, not because anyone shouted it down, but because truth walked in quietly and stood behind it. That moment had arrived. The defendant shifted in place, no longer leaning back with the posture of a man untouchable. His hand moved to adjust his shirt, his eyes darting toward the gallery as if suddenly aware that mocking generosity was not a strength anyone admired. Judge Judy lifted the first sheet of paper from the case file. "Let's look at the timeline," she murmured, her voice steady. "Neutral. The kind of tone that people mistake for softness right before it ruins them." The landlord offered reduced rent for the first 3 months. The room stayed still. He forgave late fees, repeatedly. A lady in the back row raised her brows. "And after you began earning, you still did not pay." She placed the sheet down, folded her hands, and just looked at him. Not with rage, with clarity. And clarity is the sharpest blade in any courtroom. The defendant opened his mouth, but she raised a finger. Just one. A silent reminder. You will speak when truth allows it, not arrogance. She turned her gaze to the landlord. "Why did you waive the late fees?" The man hesitated, his voice soft, weighted with something personal, something he would have preferred to keep private. He said, "His mother was ill. He told me he was struggling to keep up with hospital expenses. I believed him. You could feel the breath leave half the room. Sympathy surfaced. A few heads shook, not at the landlord, but at the man who used sickness as a shield. The landlord swallowed, his voice trembling, not weak, but tired from being too strong for too long. I didn't want him to lose his home during something like that. I remembered what it felt like to be young and scared. So I helped him, a kindness no one ever heard about, a sacrifice no one ever saw, and the defendant? He scoffed. She was sick. But I mean, he didn't need to go that far. That's his choice. Doesn't make me a villain. There it was. The brittle shell trying desperately not to crack. Judge Judy did not react immediately. She let silence do the speaking, and silence in her hands was artillery. You lied about your mother's health to avoid paying rent? She asked. Never said she died, he mumbled, shrugging. Just used the truth in a way that worked for me. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Disgust. Disbelief. Disappointment. Judy's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. Compassion was offered to you, and you weaponized it. His jaw tightened. I had to look out for myself. That isn't self-preservation, she said. It's self-infatuation. For the first time, his bravado looked heavy, like a costume he regretted putting on but couldn't take off without admitting who he really was underneath. Then Judy leaned forward, not overpowering him, simply taking back the space he had tried to steal. You keep insisting he's wealthy and you are not. Is that correct? He nodded quickly, eager for familiar ground. Yes, he has properties. He has stability. Why should someone like me? And yet, Judy interrupted gently, with all his resources, he still showed you empathy. And with nothing to your name but excuses, you offered him contempt. The gallery exhaled as if someone had punctured a balloon inflated with arrogance. He froze. No comeback. No swagger. Just the sudden suffocating awareness that the room saw him. Not the image he projected, but the truth he had been hiding beneath it. Judge Judy didn't slam the gavel. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, you didn't exploit wealth. You betrayed generosity. And that sentence, quiet as it was, landed harder than any shout could have. He looked away then, that subtle tilt of the head people make when the fight isn't over. But they already feel the loss spreading through their bones because this wasn't about unpaid rent anymore. This was about the part of him he hoped no one would see, and the part the world now couldn't unsee. The truth wasn't done yet, and neither was she. There was still one reveal left, one detail not yet spoken that would shatter the last piece of armor he thought he had. And when it came, he would break in front of everyone. When pride begins to suffocate, it doesn't go quietly. It thrashes. And in that courtroom, pride was choking hard. The defendant shifted again, tugging at his collar like the air had grown too thick to swallow. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by a twitch. The kind people get when they realize their bluff has been called, but they still can't admit the hand was empty. Judge Judy didn't speak at first. She simply studied him. She had the patience of someone who had watched countless people try to climb moral mountains, using ropes made of excuses. The kind that always snap. You said you had to look out for yourself. She began slowly, her voice almost gentle. Tell me, in your mind is survival the same as deception? He forced a laugh, but it sounded like it hurt coming out. I didn't deceive anyone, I just used the situation. Used kindness, she corrected softly. He glanced at the gallery, searching for anyone who agreed. But not one face tilted in sympathy. Even the air seemed to lean away from him. Judy turned back to the landlord. How long did he claim his mother was in treatment? The landlord took a breath, steadying emotions that had been bruised long before today. From month 4 onward, he said. He'd send messages, hospital bills, doctor's appointments. Said every paycheck went to helping her. Judy's brow lifted. And did you see those bills? The landlord nodded. Screenshots, photos. The defendant jumped in, desperate for control. They were real. I never said they weren't real. Judy raised a hand, not harsh but firm. Real bills. She leaned back, her expression unreadable. For a woman who wasn't receiving treatment. The room froze again, though this time the silence felt like it was watching him drown. He swallowed hard. I mean, she had treatment at some point. I just reused the photos. There it was. The truth trying to sneak out in pieces, hoping fragmentation would soften the blow. Judy tilted her head, a quiet sadness in her eyes. You didn't reuse photos. You reused suffering, he looked away. His voice small now, fragile around the edges. You act like I committed a crime. Judy clasped her hands together. There are crimes against law, she said softly. And then there are crimes against humanity. A hush fell, the kind that settles when moral gravity pulls everyone down at once. You could have worked out a payment plan, she continued. You could have paid in installments. You could have been honest. The defendant's lips quivered, the bravado now a paper mask melting under heat. And if I did? He whispered. He still wouldn't have needed the money. That sentence, so revealing, so painfully small, pulled a sharp inhale from the gallery. You mistook generosity for wealth, Judy said. And assumed wealth comes without sacrifice. She motioned to the landlord. Tell me, why did you have reduced income during those months? The landlord hesitated, not for drama but because humility doesn't like recounting pain. My wife, he said quietly. She was recovering from surgery. I took time off work to care for her. Income slowed. We tightened expenses. Judy's voice softened. And yet you still extended mercy. He nodded once. It felt like the right thing, a pause. Then Judy turned to the defendant, voice like silk wrapped around steel. While you pretended your mother was ill, his wife actually was. The man's face fell, not in shock, but in shame so dense it was nearly visible. The courtroom didn't gasp this time. They didn't need to. The truth didn't need applause, and it had already won. You didn't just steal money, Judy said. You stole empathy. You took kindness from someone who needed kindness himself. His voice broke slightly, a crack in concrete. I didn't know. That is not a defense, Judy replied, voice steady. That is a confession. The heavy-set man stared down at the table, chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, as if each inhale now demanded humility he'd never practiced. And do you know the cruelest part? Judy asked. You believed wealth meant he wouldn't feel your betrayal, but the wealthy don't feel these cuts less. She leaned forward, and now her voice, barely above a whisper, carried the weight of every case she ever presided over. They feel them more, Paz, because they chose generosity when they didn't have to. And you chose exploitation when you didn't need to. He blinked fast, fighting the sting behind his eyes. Pride was bleeding, and there was nothing left to cover the wound. There was no explosion, no shouting, just the slow collapse of ego under the unbearable truth of its own reflection. And yet, one more piece still waited in the shadows, a revelation that would turn this from moral lesson into reckoning. The courtroom didn't know it. He didn't know it. But Judy did, and she wasn't done, not even close. Humiliation rarely arrives with thunder. Sometimes it walks in quietly, holding only one sentence, and that's enough to bring an empire of ego to its knees. Judge Judy folded her hands and looked at the defendant. Not like a judge looking at a case, but like a human being looking at someone who had never learned what humanity meant. You say he has more, she began softly, and because he has more you felt entitled to take. Let me ask you this. She leaned forward slowly, intentionally, her voice calm enough to feel like a blade wrapped in velvet. If you believe people with more owe you something, why didn't you give anything when you finally had enough? The man blinked. It was such a simple question. A child could have answered it. But arrogance has no vocabulary for accountability. He opened his mouth, closed it. Tried again. Nothing came out but silence, the kind that exposes, not protects. His shoulders sank. Not dramatically, just enough to show the weight finally landing on him. I was trying to get ahead, he whispered. Judy didn't nod. She didn't soften. Sometimes mercy isn't letting someone fall gently. It's making them understand why they're falling. You weren't trying to get ahead, she replied. You were trying to stand on someone else so you didn't have to climb. His eyes flickered, shame creeping in where arrogance once lived. And you didn't choose someone wealthy, she continued. You chose the man who gave you a chance. The man who believed you. The man who sacrificed for his own family now, and still helped you. She let that sit. It hit harder than shouting ever could. You didn't steal money, she said quietly. You stole trust. The gallery was still. Not even a cough. Not even a shuffle. And then Judy delivered the line that shattered him completely. A real man pays who helped him. A coward waits until it's convenient. The defendant looked down, for the first time truly down, not avoiding eye contact, but finally seeing himself in the reflection of what he'd done. It wasn't anger in his face. It was recognition, the kind that hurts more than punishment. His lips trembled, just once. You want the world to believe you were surviving? Judy said. But survival doesn't mock the hand that held it up. Only ego does. He didn't defend himself. He couldn't. Arrogance had finally run out of air, and in that moment everyone saw it. Judge Judy had never been the underdog. She had simply chosen patience instead of power, silence instead of spectacle. Truth instead of triumph, and truth, a quiet, steady, unshakable, had just won. He didn't look up again. Not once. The bravado that swaggered into the courtroom earlier sat abandoned somewhere between arrogance and realization, and what replaced it was the raw, unfamiliar weight of consequence. His shoulders rounded, his stare fixed on the table. fingers tracing the grain in desperate repetition, like he hoped the wood might give him an escape his pride could not. And Judge Judy. She didn't gloat. Real authority doesn't celebrate the fall. It acknowledges the truth that forced it. She leaned back, breathing in slowly, as if absorbing every emotion in the room. The landlord's exhaustion, the gallery's moral outrage, the defendant's shrinking ego, and the silent crown of dignity that had chosen to sit with kindness rather than power. "You believe wealth owes you kindness," she said softly. "You never considered that kindness might have built that wealth in the first place." The defendant's chest tightened. You could see the small rise and fall, the shallow breath of someone learning humility, not by choice, but by exposure. The landlord looked over at him, not with hatred, not with smug victory, just disappointment. The quiet kind that hurts deeper than anger ever could. "I helped you," he whispered, "and you punished me for it." Those words didn't hit like an accusation, they landed like a eulogy. A eulogy for trust, for faith in humanity, for the simple belief that if you lift someone, they won't try to stand on your neck. The defendant's lips parted like he wanted to answer. Maybe apologize. Maybe defend himself, maybe explain, but nothing came out. Shame numbs the tongue faster than pride sharpens it. Judge Judy turned to the landlord. "In a world where kindness is often mistaken for weakness," she said, "you chose grace. And grace is never wasted, even when people fail to deserve it." A hush swept through the room again. There's a sacredness in hearing decency honored. The way it reminds people that good hasn't gone extinct. It just refuses to shout. Then Judy looked back at the defendant. "You did not take advantage of wealth," she said. "You took advantage of kindness. And that is far uglier." He flinched, not physically but emotionally, a bruise forming beneath the surface where ego used to live. "And worse," she continued, her tone lower, steady, devastating in its calm. "You thought you could disguise entitlement as struggle. There it was, the truth that stripped him bare. He wasn't a survivor. He was a taker who wore survival like camouflage." His eyes watered, not a breakdown, not a sob, just one tiny fracture leaking through the armor he had built out of excuses. "Stand up," she said quietly. He obeyed, slower this time, shoulders bent not from size but from surrender. "You will repay every month," Judy said. "Every late fee he forgave. Every dollar you claimed you could not give. Because debt is not always measured in money." She let the words breathe. "Sometimes debt is measured in character, and today you begin to pay both." The man nodded, one stiff, humbled nod, for the first time since entering the courtroom. He wasn't resisting. He was listening. "And when you make that payment," she added, "don't think of it as punishment." A pause. "Think of it as the day you stopped confusing mercy with weakness and started becoming someone who earns what he receives." He swallowed. Hard. People don't change in a moment, but they begin in one, and this was his beginning. Judy sat back, and even without a gavel, the room felt the verdict. No dramatics. No shouting. Just moral gravity, heavier than any courtroom hammer could ever be. Then she spoke one final time, voice softer than before and almost compassionate. "When someone gives you a chance, you pay them back. Not because the law demands it, but because integrity does." And there it was. The lesson, the scar, the dignity resurrected in a world that too often doubts it exists. The defendant wiped at his eye. One quick motion like he hoped no one would see. But everyone saw. Not weakness. Growth trying to breathe. The landlord nodded once, not triumphant, simply relieved that the world still had order, still had justice, still rewarded good even when good arrives quietly. And Judge Judy? Still calm, still small in stature, still massive in presence. She hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. She didn't win with volume, she won with truth because real power doesn't roar. It rests, and waits, and rises at the exact moment the world needs reminding who it belongs to. And today, it belonged to dignity, to gratitude, to principle, and to one judge who chose patience over pride and still conquered both. Before we reach the final verdict, tell me honestly in the comments, have you ever helped someone, and they turned on you once they got what they wanted? Your story might remind someone they're not alone. The courtroom didn't erupt. No applause, no gasps, no cheers. Just the kind of silence that only arrives when a moment is too heavy for sound to carry. People didn't need noise. They needed time to feel what they'd just witnessed. Truth doesn't always shock. Sometimes it settles, it seeps, it lingers in the ribcage like a reminder from life itself. Character counts more than comfort, and dignity is louder than ego ever will be. The defendant stood there, not the towering force he tried to be, Not the defiant rebel against unfair wealth he pretended to represent, but a man stripped of excuses. Stripped of audience approval. Stripped of stories he told himself to sleep at night. And Judge Judy, still calm, still seated, still the smallest person in the room but somehow the largest, spoke again, not delivering punishment but truth. "You are going to repay every owed amount," she said. "In full. And then some." He nodded, jaw tight, eyes unfocused. It wasn't fear now. It was realization stacking like bricks on his conscience. "You will return," Judy continued. "Every bit of rent you withheld, because while you convinced yourself you were surviving, you were feeding your pride, not your stomach." That line settled deep, not just in him but in the gallery. People know hunger. People understand survival. But exploiting kindness to avoid responsibility? That sits differently. It stains differently. "You will also cover court costs," she added. His throat bobbed. A tiny acknowledgement. Not complaint, not protest, just acceptance. "And listen carefully," she said, leaning forward slightly, voice low. "This is not punishment. This is alignment. Life must correct imbalance before it breaks." He blinked slowly, like each word pierced deeper than the last. Not because it was harsh, but because it was true. "You think because someone has more?" Judy continued. "They deserve to give without limits. But prosperity earned through effort doesn't owe a debt to entitlement." She pointed gently toward the landlord. Not commanding attention, but granting it. He worked. He built, he sacrificed, he extended grace when he had no obligation to. The landlord looked down again, modest even now. Good people often shrink when praised. Humility is their instinct. "And you," Judy turned back to the defendant, "took advantage of grace because it cost you nothing to receive it. You never considered the cost it took to give it." The defendant swallowed again. Shame has a way of drying the voice, tightening the throat. "You lied about need," she continued, "because you wanted comfort without effort. You abused sympathies, and that is a theft deeper than money." He didn't move. Didn't blink. Anyone could see something breaking inside him. Not pride anymore, but the illusion that pride had protected him all this time. "You asked why you should pay someone who already has much," she said. "I will tell you why." She paused and every eye leaned forward. "People who have built deserve respect, not resentment. People who give deserve honor, not exploitation." You could sense the energy shift. Not dramatic, but grounded, moral, human. "Your problem," she said softly, "is not lack of money. It is lack of gratitude." A tear slipped. He brushed it quickly, trying to pretend it didn't exist, but he knew, everyone knew. Arrogance was no longer armor, it was rubble. "And today," she finished, "you will begin learning the value of what was offered to you, and what you squandered by confusing generosity with obligation." She leaned back. Calm again, verdict settled not by force but by truth that could not be argued. Judgment for the plaintiff. The gavel wasn't needed. The words alone were final enough. The defendant sat slowly, like gravity had doubled just for him. He didn't storm out. Didn't argue. Didn't mutter about unfairness or wealth inequality or systems. Some people only meet reality when consequences hold their hand and refuse to let go. The landlord gathered his papers quietly. You could see his hands tremble. Not with anger, not even with relief, but with the lingering ache of being betrayed by someone he rooted for. People forget, being good is easy. Staying good after someone wrongs you is the real test. He turned slightly toward the defendant, not to gloat, not to shame, but simply to see the human being he once believed in. And in that glance a story lived. "I wanted you to win too. I just wanted you to do it right." The defendant couldn't meet his eyes. His shoulders curled inward. A sign that ego had finally surrendered to self-awareness. One painful truth about growing up is realizing that the mirror is sometimes the harshest judge in the room. And Judge Judy? She sat back, hands folded, expression softening just barely. The way a teacher looks not at a troublemaker but at someone who might finally be ready to learn. She didn't smile. She didn't soften into sentimentality. She didn't need to. Her lesson wasn't kindness instead of justice. It was kindness through justice. There's a difference. A powerful one. Some judges swing hammers. She raised people. Even the ones who didn't deserve it yet. Court adjourned. People rose. The gallery slowly emptied, voices hushed. Out of respect, not command. The landlord exited first. Slow steps, quiet composure. The dignity of a man who never needed to humiliate someone to feel tall. Behind him the defendant stood. He hesitated. Not from fear of cameras or gossip, but because facing the world after losing to truth requires more courage than he had ever practiced. He didn't storm. He didn't stomp, he walked. One step at a time, the same way humility arrives. When he reached the door, he stopped, half turning back toward Judy. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. But he whispered, low, raw, barely audible. I'll pay him. Not a defense, not an excuse. Just a sentence stripped of ego. And maybe that was the first real thing he'd said all day. Life will always test you with two questions. What do you do when you have nothing? What do you do when someone gives you something? This man failed the second test. But redemption doesn't begin with being right. It begins with finally admitting you were wrong. Kindness is not weakness. Generosity is not naivety. And humility is not defeat. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who never needed to raise their voice. Real talk. If you've ever helped someone who later disrespected you, if you've ever been kind and treated like you were foolish for it, if you've ever believed in someone who turned your belief into their excuse, type respect isn't free in the comments, not to shame them, but to remind the world that dignity, compassion, and integrity aren't relics. They live in people like you, and as long as they do, there's hope. Now hit subscribe, share your story below, and remember, being kind is not weakness. It's choosing strength without needing applause, and someone out there needed to hear that today. Karen denied the HOA rules. Judy held them up with her signature. What Karen didn't know was that Judy had been secretly recording every single one of her violations for 2 years. And tonight she was about to unleash a bombshell that would destroy Karen's reign of terror forever. The Willowbrook Community Center meeting room buzzed with nervous energy, under harsh fluorescent lights that cast sharp shadows across rows of metal folding chairs. The polished conference table at the front gleamed like a judicial bench, and behind it sat the most feared woman in the neighborhood, Karen Mitchell, HOA board president and self-appointed queen of suburban tyranny. Before we dive into this incredible case, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing where my viewers are around the world. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss more unbelievable cases like this one. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Karen adjusted her designer blazer and tapped her perfectly manicured nails against her leather portfolio, a satisfied smirk playing across her lips. For 3 years, she had ruled this community with an iron fist, wielding HOA regulations like weapons against anyone who dared to live freely in their own homes. Tonight was going to be her crowning achievement. The night she would pass the most restrictive set of rules Willowbrook had ever seen, rules that would give her absolute control over every mailbox, every garden, every breath her neighbors took. What she didn't realize was that her reign was about to end with a single signature from the most unlikely source imaginable. At the back of the room, in the shadows cast by the overhead projector, sat Judy Martinez, a 78-year-old retired librarian whose gentle demeanor had fooled everyone, including Karen, into believing she was just another harmless elderly resident. Judy's weathered hands rested calmly in her lap, but beside her chair sat a small brown folder that contained enough evidence to topple Karen's empire of harassment and expose the shocking truth about who the real rule breaker was in Willowbrook. For months, while Karen had been terrorizing families over Christmas decorations and garden gnomes, Judy had been conducting the most thorough investigation the HOA had ever seen, documenting violations that would make Karen's victims look like saints. The meeting hadn't even started, but the tension was already suffocating. Residents filed in with defeated expressions, their shoulders slumped from years of Karen's relentless persecution. Mrs. Chen clutched her purse tightly, still traumatized from last month's public humiliation over her wind chimes. The Morrison family sat rigidly in the front row, their teenage son banned from playing basketball in his own driveway after Karen deemed the sound disruptive to community peace. These weren't just neighbors anymore. They were survivors of Karen's systematic campaign of control, and tonight, they expected more of the same crushing defeat they'd endured for 3 long years. Karen stood and surveyed her kingdom with the confidence of a dictator addressing her subjects. She had no idea that tonight would be different, that the quiet librarian in the back row had spent decades mastering the art of research and documentation, skills that had uncovered a web of Karen's own violations so extensive it would shock even her victims. What Karen had dismissed as harmless record-keeping was actually a legal arsenal that would expose her as the biggest hypocrite in HOA history. The irony was perfect. The enforcer was about to become the condemned, and it would all come down to one signature on a document that would change everything. Before we see how Judy dismantled Karen's empire of hypocrisy with nothing but the truth, smash that like button if you've ever dealt with an HOA tyrant who thought the rules didn't apply to them, and subscribe because what happens next will restore your faith in justice. This isn't just about one neighborhood meeting. It's about the moment when years of silent suffering finally found its voice in the most unexpected hero imaginable. Karen's gavel struck the table with the authority of a judge sentencing criminals, and the room fell into the kind of terrified silence that had become Willowbrook's new normal. Tonight's meeting will address critical community standards that have been dangerously ignored, she announced, her voice carrying the cold precision of someone who had perfected the art of intimidation. Behind her, a PowerPoint presentation flickered to life, displaying a list of new restrictions so comprehensive it would make a prison warden proud. No garden decorations over 6 inches tall, no plants that weren't pre-approved by the architectural committee, mandatory beige mailboxes only, and a monthly aesthetic maintenance fee of $200 per household to fund Karen's vision of suburban perfection. The residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, knowing that resistance was futile but hoping anyone would find the courage to speak up. Karen had systematically destroyed every previous challenger through a campaign of harassment, so ruthless it had become legendary in the neighborhood. When Bob Peterson had questioned a fence height rule last year, Karen had responded by reporting his trash cans for being visible from the street, his Christmas lights for being too bright, and his dog for barking during quiet hours that she had invented specifically to target him. Bob had moved away within 6 months, broken by the constant stream of violation notices and legal threats that Karen wielded like weapons of mass destruction. These enhancements will ensure Willowbrook maintains its status as a premier community, Karen continued, her smile as sharp as broken glass. Property values depend on everyone following the same high standards, and I won't tolerate the kind of chaos that has been plaguing our streets. She clicked to the next slide, revealing photographs of supposed violations that made the audience gasp. Mrs. Chen's wind chimes, labeled as noise pollution. The Morrisons' basketball hoop, branded as recreational equipment disruption. Even elderly Mr. Garcia's memorial garden for his late wife was pictured with the caption, unauthorized, landscaping deviation. But what Karen didn't mention, what she had carefully omitted from her presentation, was that her own backyard contained the most egregious violations in the entire community. While she was demanding beige mailboxes from everyone else, her own designer mailbox stood as a towering monument to hypocrisy, crafted from expensive stone and standing nearly 4 feet tall with decorative elements that violated at least 6 of the rules she had written herself. Her backyard paradise featured an unauthorized hot tub installation, a deck that extended beyond permitted boundaries, and a garden shed painted in colors that would earn any other resident a $500 fine. From the back of the room, Judy watched with the patience of someone who had spent 30 years dealing with difficult patrons in the library, knowing exactly when to speak and when to let others reveal their true nature. She had witnessed Karen's performance many times before, but tonight felt different because tonight, she was armed with something Karen had never encountered. The truth documented with the meticulous precision that only a professional researcher could provide. Her brown folder contained photographs, timestamps, measurements, and legal citations that would expose Karen's empire as nothing more than a house of cards built on lies and selective enforcement. Karen advanced to her next target, a young mother named Sarah, who had committed the unforgivable sin of installing a small playground in her backyard for her disabled son. Recreational structures require architectural committee approval, Karen declared, her voice dripping with false authority. Mrs. Williams has been operating in violation of community standards for 3 months. Despite multiple warnings, and Sarah's face crumpled as she realized her son's only source of outdoor therapy was about to be destroyed by Karen's need for control. That's when Judy's calm voice cut through the toxic atmosphere like a knife through butter. "Excuse me, Karen," she said, her tone so gentle it almost sounded apologetic. "Before we discuss Sarah's playground, could you help us understand how your hot tub installation received architectural committee approval?" The room went dead silent, every eye turning toward the back where the elderly librarian sat with her hands folded, looking for all the world like someone asking about library hours, rather than launching the first shot in a war that would change everything. Karen's confident smile flickered for just a moment, a crack in the facade that everyone noticed. "That's completely different," she snapped, her voice losing its smooth authority. "Board members have different procedures for improvements that benefit the entire community." But Judy's question had accomplished something no one had managed in 3 years. It had put Karen on the defensive, and the residents could smell blood in the water for the first time since her reign of terror began. Karen's jaw tightened as she realized Judy wasn't going to back down like every other resident had before. "The hot tub was approved through proper channels," she lied smoothly, but her voice carried a slight tremor that hadn't been there moments earlier. "We're not here to discuss board member improvements. We're here to address community violations that affect everyone." She clicked aggressively to the next slide, trying to regain control of the narrative, But Judy's question had already planted a seed of doubt in the minds of residents who had never dared to question Karen's authority before. "Let me tell you about Mrs. Chen's wind chimes," Judy said, standing slowly with the deliberate grace of someone who had commanded library audiences for decades. Her voice remained soft, but it carried an authority that made everyone lean forward to listen. Those aren't just decorations hanging in her garden. They were handcrafted by her late husband during his final months of chemotherapy, each chime tuned to play their wedding song when the wind catches them just right. After he passed, those chimes became Mrs. Chen's way of feeling his presence, especially during the lonely evening, hours when grief felt too heavy to bear alone. Room fell completely silent as Judy's words painted a picture of love and loss that made Karen's persecution feel monstrous. Mrs. Chen wiped tears from her eyes, shocked that someone had taken the time to understand the true meaning behind what Karen had dismissed as mere noise pollution. Other residents began to see their own struggles reflected in the story, realizing that Karen's reign of terror had been destroying not just property aesthetics, but the very soul of their community. Karen's face flushed red as she felt the room's energy shifting away from her control. "Rules are rules," she snapped, her mask of authority slipping to reveal the petty tyrant underneath. "I don't have time for sentimental stories about every piece of unauthorized decoration in this neighborhood. Standards exist for a reason, and I won't compromise community values for emotional manipulation." But her harsh words only made the contrast more stark between Judy's compassion and Karen's cruelty. "Speaking of rules," Judy continued with devastating gentleness, "I couldn't help but notice your dogs barking past the 10 p.m. quiet hours you established last year. And that garage sale you held 2 months ago, was that properly permitted through the Community Events Committee?" Each question landed like a precision strike, exposing Karen's selective enforcement with surgical accuracy. The residents watched in amazement as their tormentor squirmed under the same scrutiny she had used to destroy their peace for 3 years. Karen's empire of fear was crumbling, and everyone could see it happening in real time. Karen slammed her gavel so hard it cracked the wooden handle, her face contorted with rage as she felt her absolute authority slipping through her fingers. "That's enough," she screamed, abandoning all pretense of professional conduct. "I will not tolerate this disrespect from residents who clearly don't understand the burden of community leadership. Anyone who continues to question board decisions will face immediate violation proceedings and legal action." The threat hung in the air like poison gas, and for a moment the old fear crept back into the residents' faces as they remembered the devastating consequences of crossing Karen Mitchell. But Judy didn't flinch. She reached for her brown folder with the calm precision of a surgeon selecting the perfect scalpel, her movements deliberate and unhurried, despite the explosive tension filling the room. "Karen," she said, her voice carrying 30 years of authority earned through knowledge rather than intimidation, "I think it's time everyone saw what real community leadership looks like." The folder opened with a soft whisper that seemed to echo like thunder in the stunned silence. "For the past 24 months, Judy announced, pulling out a thick stack of meticulously organized documents, "I've been documenting every violation of HOA rules in our community, including those committed by our board president." She held up the first photograph, a crystal-clear image of Karen's unauthorized deck extension that violated setback requirements by 3 feet. "This was taken on March 15, 2023, 2 weeks after you fined the Hendersons for a deck that was only 6 inches over the line." The audience gasped as Judy continued her methodical destruction of Karen's credibility. "Here's your stone mailbox installed without architectural committee approval. Photographed on June 8, 2023. Another photo appeared, showing Karen's elaborate mailbox that stood in flagrant violation of the very beige mailbox rule she was trying to impose tonight. "And this is your hot tub installation, begun on September 3, 2023, without permits, environmental impact assessment, or neighbor notification as required by Section 12 of the HOA bylaws." Karen's face went from red to white as the evidence mounted, each photograph a nail in the coffin of her tyrannical reign. "You can't spy on board members," she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. "This is harassment, invasion of privacy, and completely illegal." But her protests only made her look more guilty, as residents began pulling out their phones to photograph Judy's evidence, finally seeing proof of what they had suspected all along. The most devastating revelation came last. Judy produced a thick manila envelope sealed with official HOA stamps. "This contains 47 documented violations committed by Karen Mitchell over 2 years, she announced, with a total accumulated fine structure of $18,400, according to the penalty schedule Karen herself proposed and voted into law. The number hit the room like a physical blow, and Karen's empire of hypocrisy collapsed in an instant. Karen's desperation reached fever pitch as she realized her empire was crumbling beyond repair. Even if those allegations were true, she snarled, her voice shaking with barely controlled panic. I have board authority to override any concerns about my personal property. The community elected me to make decisions, and I have executive privilege to interpret rules as necessary for community welfare. It was her final gambit, a last-ditch attempt to claim immunity from the very laws she had used to terrorize her neighbors for 3 years. The residents murmured uncertainly, their brief moment of hope flickering as Karen invoked mysterious board powers they didn't understand. Several people shifted in their seats, wondering if Karen might actually have legal protection that would let her escape justice once again. The atmosphere grew tense as everyone waited to see if their tormentor would slip through the cracks of bureaucratic loopholes she had spent years constructing. But Judy smiled for the first time all evening, a gentle expression that somehow carried more authority than all of Karen's screaming and gavel-pounding combined. She reached into her folder one final time and withdrew a pristine copy of the Willowbrook HOA Constitution, its pages marked with colorful tabs that showed decades of professional research experience. Actually, Karen, she said with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent 30 years mastering complex legal documents, let me share what our founding charter says about that. Judy opened to a highlighted section and read with perfect clarity. Article 12, Section 4. All board members are subject to identical community standards as general residents, with no exceptions granted for position, tenure, or claimed administrative necessity. Her voice carried the weight of absolute legal authority as she continued. Furthermore, Section 5 states that board members found in violation of community standards face automatic removal proceedings and double penalty assessments to maintain public trust. The room exploded in gasps as the implications sank in. Karen wasn't just facing $18,000 in fines, she was looking at $36,000 and immediate removal from office. Her face went ashen as she realized her own constitution had become the weapon of her destruction. Karen's world imploded in slow motion as the mathematical reality of her destruction sank in. $36,000 in fines, automatic removal from office, and public humiliation in front of the very community she had terrorized for 3 years. Her hands trembled as she gripped the conference table, her knuckles white with the desperate fury of someone watching their empire burn to ashes. This is impossible, she whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice. I built this community. I protected property values. I made the hard decisions nobody else would make. But the residents were no longer listening to Karen's delusions of grandeur. 3 years of suppressed anger and frustration erupted like a volcanic explosion, as neighbor after neighbor stood up to share their own horror stories of Karen's reign of terror. Mrs. Rodriguez rose first, her voice shaking with emotion as she described how Karen had forced her to remove her late mother's rose garden because the flowers were non-native, species that disrupted community aesthetics. The garden had been her mother's final gift, planted during her last visit before cancer took her life, but Karen had shown no mercy in demanding its destruction. The young Morrison father stood next, his jaw clenched with barely controlled rage as he recounted how Karen had banned his autistic son from riding his bicycle on community sidewalks, claiming the child's happy laughter during his therapeutic rides constituted excessive recreational noise. The boy had retreated into depression, losing his primary source of joy and exercise because Karen found his happiness inconvenient to her vision of sterile suburban perfection. One by one, the stories poured out like water through a broken dam. Karen had forced the elderly Kowalski couple to remove their Polish flag during Heritage Month, claiming it violated uniformity standards. She had banned the teenage Martinez girls' quinceañera decorations, calling them culturally inappropriate displays. She had even tried to prevent the community's annual children's Halloween parade, arguing that costumes and candy created liability concerns and property damage risks. The pattern became crystal clear to everyone in the room. Karen hadn't been protecting community standards. She had been systematically destroying everything that made Willowbrook feel like home. Every act of joy, every cultural celebration, every personal memorial had been crushed under her boot heel in service of a cold, heartless vision that benefited no one except her need for absolute control. As the testimonies continued, Karen's face grew paler and paler, the weight of her cruelty finally becoming visible even to herself. Judy watched with the calm satisfaction of someone who had delivered perfect justice, not through revenge or anger, but through the simple power of documented truth. The community had found its voice at last, and Karen's 3-year nightmare was finally ending in the, bright light of accountability. The meeting room that had once echoed with Karen's tyrannical demands now filled with something it hadn't experienced in 3 years: hope. Karen sat slumped in her chair, her designer blazer wrinkled and her perfect composure shattered beyond repair. The woman who had once commanded fear with a single glance now looked small and defeated, staring at the evidence of her own hypocrisy spread across the table, like the remnants of a demolished dictatorship. Her empire of intimidation had crumbled not through violence or revenge, but through the quiet power of one elderly librarian armed with nothing but truth, and a folder full of photographs. Without a word, Karen reached into her leather portfolio and withdrew a single sheet of paper, her hands shaking as she scrawled her resignation letter in defeated silence. The same hands that had once signed violation notices with sadistic pleasure now trembled, as they wrote the words that would end her reign forever. She stood on unsteady legs, gathered her belongings, and walked toward the exit as the community she had terrorized watched in stunned silence. At the doorway, she turned back one final time, her face a mask of bitter defeat, before disappearing into the night and taking her 3 years of cruelty with her. The transformation was immediate and miraculous. Judy was unanimously elected as interim board president, and her first official act was to rescind every punitive rule Karen had implemented during her reign of terror. Mrs. Chen's wind chimes would continue to play their wedding song in the evening breeze. The Morrison boy could ride his bicycle and laugh as loudly as his heart desired. The Kowalski's Polish flag would fly proudly during heritage celebrations, and the annual Halloween parade would return with more joy than ever before. But the changes went deeper than just rule reversals. Under Judy's gentle leadership, monthly community meetings became celebrations of connection rather than sessions of intimidation. Property values actually increased as the neighborhood transformed from a sterile prison into a vibrant community, where families wanted to live and raise their children. Karen had moved away within 4 months, unable to face the daily reminder of how her pursuit of control had ultimately cost her everything she claimed to protect. The lesson here cuts straight to the heart of what real leadership means. Karen had confused fear with respect and control with authority, building her power on the foundation of other people's misery. But Judy showed us that true strength comes from patience, preparation, and the courage to stand up for what's right when it matters most. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against a bully isn't anger or confrontation. It's simply the truth documented with care and presented with grace. Justice served with nothing but facts and a folder full of photographs. What's the most satisfying moment of karma you've ever witnessed in your own neighborhood? Drop your stories in the comments below. And if you love seeing bullies face the consequences of their own actions, subscribe for more epic tales of underdogs who changed everything. Remember, sometimes the quietest voice in the room carries the biggest stick, and patient preparation beats loud intimidation every single time. Truth always wins in the end.